Chapter 6. Ronald Reagan understood something many politicians never quite grasp. Moments of national grief are not only felt, they are performed. Before the presidency, he had spent a lifetime in front of cameras, learning how tone, pause, and presence could shape how people experienced an event. At Andrews Air Force Base on June 22, 1985, that instinct mattered. The ceremony was not simply a memorial, it was a signal to grieving families, to the American public, and to adversaries watching closely from abroad. Reagan stepped to the podium with the bearing of a man who knew the country expected steadiness. He spoke first to the families, grounding his remarks in their loss rather than in policy. He named the Marines not as symbols, but as men, sons, husbands, fathers, whose absence would leave a permanent silence at kitchen tables and in quiet homes across the country. Only then did he widen the frame. The attack in Zona Rosa, he said, was not random violence. It was an act of terrorism designed to test American resolve, to force hesitation, to create doubt. The United States would not yield to that pressure. Those responsible would be pursued. Justice, however long it took, would come. These were not casual lines written for a speech. They were commitments delivered in public, at a moment when the cost of those words was visible in flag-draped coffins behind him. Reagan understood that once spoken in that setting, they could not easily be walked back. President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan walk beside the flag-draped coffins of U.S. Marines during a solemn ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base. What he did not say outright, but what lingered beneath the surface, was that this was not the first time he had stood in such a moment. The memory of the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing still hung over his presidency. So did the long shadow of Vietnam War, a conflict that had reshaped how Americans viewed military commitments abroad. Even as he projected confidence, Reagan was acutely aware that public patience for overseas entanglements was not unlimited. That tension between resolve and restraint defined everything that followed. Congress and the machinery of response. In Washington, grief quickly hardened into political momentum. The Zona Rosa killings arrived at a moment when the administration's Central America policy was already under intense scrutiny. Debates over funding anti-communist forces in the region, particularly the Nicaraguan Contras, had divided Congress sharply. Skepticism about intervention was growing, especially among Democrats who questioned both the strategy and the moral cost. The murder of 4 U.S. Marines did not settle those debates, but it changed the emotional terrain on which they were fought. Abstract arguments about foreign policy suddenly carried the weight of fresh graves. Within weeks, the administration moved to act. Under the umbrella of what became known as the Act to Combat International Terrorism, the U.S. government announced a $100,000 reward for information leading to the conviction of those responsible for the attack. The offer was broadcast across El Salvador and throughout the region, a clear message that the case would not quietly fade. At the same time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation expanded its role. Its legal attaché office in San Salvador became a central node in the investigation, coordinating with Salvadoran authorities, sharing forensic capabilities, and attempting to impose structure on what was, in reality, a chaotic environment. On paper, these steps signaled seriousness. They suggested a government mobilizing its resources, translating outrage into action. In practice, the situation was far more complicated. The perpetrators were not part of a conventional criminal network. They belonged to the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, a decentralized insurgent force that operated through cells, aliases, and shifting lines of support. Its members did not leave tidy trails of evidence. They disappeared into rural strongholds, urban safe houses, and communities where loyalty was often shaped by fear as much as ideology. Traditional investigative tools, warrants, interviews, surveillance had limited reach in a country where large portions of territory were contested or effectively outside government control. The attack had been executed quickly, planned carefully, and followed by a clean withdrawal. By the time investigators began piecing together what had happened, the men responsible were already gone. El Salvador. War within the investigation. In San Salvador, the reaction unfolded under very different pressures. José Napoleón Duarte faced a balancing act that few leaders could navigate cleanly. His government depended heavily on American support, financial, military, and political, and the killing of U.S. personnel placed that relationship under immediate strain. He needed to show Washington that El Salvador could deliver results. At the same time, he had to manage a military establishment that operated with its own priorities, its own chains of influence, and, at times, its own disregard for civilian oversight. The investigation moved forward with American assistance. FBI forensic support was introduced. Intelligence sharing increased. Efforts were made to track suspects through a mix of captured guerrillas, informants, and fragmentary intelligence reports. Yet the process was constrained from the beginning. El Salvador's judicial system in 1985 did not function with the independence or reliability that American officials might have preferred. Cases involving guerrilla activity often fell under military jurisdiction, where proceedings were shaped as much by political considerations as by legal standards. Evidence could be compromised. Testimony could be coerced. Outcomes were rarely predictable. And beyond the courtroom, the war itself distorted everything. Witnesses were reluctant to speak. Informants risked death. Entire communities were caught between government forces and insurgents, each side demanding loyalty and punishing perceived betrayal. In that environment, truth was not just difficult to establish, it was dangerous. The result was an investigation that, despite initial momentum, struggled to gain traction. Leads surfaced and vanished. Suspects were identified, then disappeared into the fog of a conflict that had no clear front lines. What began as a moment of unified outrage in Washington, at Andrews, in headlines across the United States, was now colliding with the reality of a war that did not yield easily to justice. Chapter 7. The bodies had not yet been flown home when the Pentagon began planning the response. In the hours after the attack on Boulevard del Hipódromo, as embassy personnel worked to account for the dead and Salvadoran investigators processed the crime scene under generator lights, a different set of conversations was already underway in Washington. The public face of the American response was grief and outrage, and the promise of justice. The private face, taking shape in classified compartments at the Pentagon and the National Security Council, was something the public would never be told about. It had a name. Operation 9 Iron. The plan was specific. American gunships already operating in the region, deployed out of Panama, their crews experienced from months of nightly surveillance flights over El Salvador, would carry out clandestine surgical strikes against guerrilla base camps inside the country. The Defense Intelligence Agency had identified the targets. 3 camps suspected of direct association with the groups responsible for the Zona Rosa attack. The mission called for precision, speed, no public announcement, no congressional notification. A clean, quiet, overwhelming response that would make clear to the FMLN, to every guerrilla organization operating in Central America, to anyone watching, that killing American Marines at a restaurant table carried consequences that no alias and no safe house could protect against. Less than a week after 4 men were murdered on a sidewalk, the plan was ready. The gunships chosen were AC-130 Spectre gunships, among the most lethal aircraft in the American arsenal, capable of sustained, precise fire from altitudes that left targets with no warning and no time to run. Their crews had been flying over El Salvador for months, mapping the terrain, tracing the movement of guerrilla units through the mountains and the capital's outskirts. They knew the country the way a hunter knows ground he has covered in the dark. They knew where the camps were. They knew the routes in and out. They had, in the language of the mission briefing, precise targets to be engaged. On June 29th, Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger was briefed in full. He listened to the operational details with the attentiveness of a man who understood that what he was hearing had not yet been shared with Congress, and would not be. When the briefing concluded, he asked a single question. What were the chances of success? The briefer paused, very low. Weinberger said nothing for a moment. Then he raised his concern about civilian casualties, about the certainty that guerrilla camps embedded in the Salvadoran countryside were never entirely separate from the villages around them, and that surgical, in the vocabulary of air warfare, was always a relative term. The assessment was honest, and it was bleak. Low probability of eliminating the specific men responsible, high probability of killing people who had nothing to do with the Zona Rosa, and the absolute certainty that any visible American military action inside El Salvador would detonate a political crisis in Congress that the administration was not prepared to survive. The meeting ended without a final decision, but the aircraft were already being prepared. Reagan had sent a personal emissary to Duarte, not a cable, not a formal diplomatic note, but a face-to-face conversation, the kind that left no paper trail. The message was simple. The United States needed Duarte's authorization to act. His government depended on American support in ways that did not appear in any public accounting. The weapons, the training, the intelligence, the quiet presence of advisors operating in the field under congressional limits nobody was enforcing too carefully. Washington was prepared to move. It needed Duarte to open the door. The emissary delivered the message. Duarte listened. And then the aircraft went up. For 2 consecutive nights, American gunships flew over El Salvador in the dark. Below them, invisible in the mountain terrain, were the camps the Defense Intelligence Agency had spent weeks mapping. The crews flew the routes they had rehearsed. They acquired the targets. They held their positions at altitude, their weapons systems active, the camps sitting in their sights with a stillness that had no idea it was being watched from above. The pilots and crew chiefs and gunners sat in the noise and vibration of the aircraft and waited for the order that would change the nature of the American involvement in El Salvador permanently and irrevocably. On the ground in San Salvador, the guerrillas who had planned the Zona Rosa attack were sleeping, or they were moving, or they were doing what clandestine fighters do in the days after a successful operation, laying low, changing locations, waiting for the immediate pressure to pass. They did not know that American gunships were circling in the darkness above the country. They did not know that men with their fingers near triggers were looking at targets connected to everything they had built. They did not know how close it came. The first night passed. The gunships returned to Panama without firing. The second night, the aircraft went up again. The same routes, the same targets acquired, the same waiting. Whatever conversation had taken place between Reagan's emissary and President Duarte, whatever had passed between them in that room without a paper trail, its answer was now visible in the silence coming down from Washington. No order. No authorization. The threshold that would have turned 9 iron into something that couldn't be taken back held for a second night. The aircraft came home. The camps below remained untouched. The guerrillas went on sleeping, or moving, or waiting for the pressure to pass, never knowing that on 2 consecutive nights the United States had been an order away from a different kind of war entirely. The operation was stood down, quietly, without announcement, without any public record that it had ever existed. José Napoleón Duarte had told Reagan's emissary what he could not say publicly and could not put in writing. He could not authorize direct American military action on Salvadoran soil. His government would do everything in its power to strike the groups responsible. But the strikes would be Salvadoran strikes. He was not opening that door. The gunships had flown for 2 nights and come home empty. Whatever was going to happen next, whatever justice meant in a country where the war was still being fought and the men who planned the killing were already underground, and the institutions built to find them were pulling in 17 directions at once. It was not going to look like Operation 9 Iron. It was going to be slower than that, quieter, and considerably harder to see.